Welcome and thank you for joining us for Reimagining Intergenerational Housing. I'm Donna Butts, the Executive Director of Generations United. I'd like to thank our partners and co-sponsors today, Nesterly and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. At Generations United, we believe that all levels of society are stronger when we build and support connections between generations. We vigorously advocate for intergenerational solutions that value the strengths of each generation and encourage them to be resources to each other. This includes in the areas of housing and community building. We are not fans of developments and gates that prevent people of different ages from connecting, sharing wisdom, and creating unique responses to issues and opportunities we grapple with at the local and national levels. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive, challenging you to reimagine intergenerational housing and communities. Joining me are two valued colleagues whose work calls on us to think about possibilities as we grapple with and advance out-of-the-box resources and responses to evolving needs in housing and community creating. First, Jennifer Malinsky, who's the director of Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies, is going to discuss their research, their findings, and trends that they're seeing. I'm going to follow next by discussing the continuum of intergenerational housing and communities that we at Generations United have identified and the learning community that we're relaunching. Noelle Marcus, is founder of Nesterly, will close the panel with a look at what they're doing, leading the area of intergenerational home sharing, as well as their plans for the future. Following the presentations, we'll have a dialogue and respond to as many of the questions that many of you asked in advance and that you'll be asking today in the Q&A as possible. So do use your Q&A function. Watch the chat where staff are going to be putting links to resources that we hope that you will find useful as you're thinking through and working through efforts in your community and elsewhere. So now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Malinsky, Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. Jen leads the center's research exploring the housing challenges facing an aging population and has written extensively about the role of housing in well-being in older age. So Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm going to set a bit of context for Donna and Noelle, laying out some trends and challenges that intergenerational housing options can help address. So go to the first slide, please. So I wanted to start by pointing out the types of households that older adults live in now. On the left, the pie chart shows that most older individuals live in their own homes, with smaller shares living in the home of a child or another person, and about 1.5 million people living in group quarters, which are most typically nursing homes. On the right, the bar charts reflect older adults living in their own households. So that's that big purple slice of the pie. The two bar charts are just sort of looking at that. And it reflects that most older households include one person or a couple. But the share of people living alone rises with age. So you can see in the far right column that sort of off-white ecru color, I guess, 56% of those 80 and over live alone. Now, if household composition stays much as it has been, we project that within the next 15 or so years, there'll be over 10 million people living alone aged 80 and over, which is double the number that there was in 2018. People in their 80s and over tend to have lower incomes than those in their 60s and 70s, and to need more help around the house and other types of support. So this is an important trend. At the same time that the numbers of people living alone are growing, so too are multi-generational households. And about 20% of older adults, older individuals, live in some kind of multi-generational household, most typically with adult children, their kids or grandkids, or just their grandkids. And this includes those who live with their adult kids in their house, and as well as whose families live with them. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Multi-generational households are more common among Black, Hispanic, and Asian families. As you can see, the shares of Hispanic and Asian older adults in their 80s and over living with family, living with family reaches to or exceeds 45%. So multi-generational households are on the rise, driven by economic precarity in some cases, care needs, and traditions. And we expect to see more of them, especially as the Hispanic population in the United States is growing. Next slide. And of course, another growing trend is house sharing, which I know Noelle will get into in depth. I've defined it here as an older adult living with someone unrelated with no other family. So this is probably an undercount. But the point I want to make with this is that while just under 2% of older adult individuals share housing with someone with whom they are not related, the numbers have grown significantly since 2006, as you can see. Another important topic, just to set the stage, 78% of older adults own their own homes. Most live in single family residences, but this still means that we have millions of older renters, and the share that rent does go up among those in their 70s and 80s. So with that picture, I want to turn to some broad challenges around housing and aging in the US on the next slide. We have significant gaps in affordability and the suitability of the housing stock itself, in access to supportive services that many people need in order to live where they choose, and a huge problem with isolation and loneliness, which does relate to where people live. So all of these things influence the types of households that older adults form, the locations they choose, and then their subsequent access to support and social engagement. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk very briefly about affordability. Over 10 million older households, that's a household headed by someone 65 or over, about a third of all older households in the US today pay more than 30% of their income on housing. We say that if you pay 30 to 50% of your income on housing, that you're moderately cost burdened. And if you pay more than 50%, you are severely cost burdened. And there are 5 million households 65 and over who are in that case severely cost burdened. So this chart, I think we try to show two things. First, that renters and owners with mortgages are most likely to face cost burdened. We know that rent increases are outpacing older renters' income, including their Social Security cost of living increases, and that more and more older adults are carrying mortgages into later life, including into their 80s and beyond. The other thing to note here is that cost burdens increase in older age groups. And this is in part because incomes tend to fall. So people in their 80s and over often have less income with which to pay down a mortgage, cover property insurance and tax, or keep up with rent. And housing assistance is available for people with very low incomes, but it is not an entitlement. We serve just over a third of older adults who qualify for it. People who are eligible and need assistance often don't get it, landing on waiting lists or doubling up or paying high shares of their income for housing and cutting back on other needs. And I'm talking about affordability for older adults, but of course, housing affordability is a widespread issue. A recent report from the Joint Center shows that housing prices and apartment rents soared to new heights in 2021, with home prices up 20% across the country, higher in some places, and rents up 12%. Housing instability is on the rise, with eviction levels back near pre-pandemic levels. On the next slide, just talk for a moment about the result of these cost burdens. So what often happens, of course, is that people must cut back on other goods and services essential to their well-being. This chart looks just at low-income older households and compares the spending on key needs between those who are affordably housed and those who are paying more than half of their income on housing. And you can see that the dramatic drop-off in spending on food, on out-of-pocket healthcare. Some people are still saving for retirement and are less able to do that, on transportation. And unfortunately, trends suggest that we'll see more people struggling with housing affordability in the future, absent new solutions, given the rising cost of goods as well as housing and widening income inequality and a growing older population. That just means more people will be struggling to make ends meet. On the next slide, talk a little bit about disability prevalence increasing with age. We know that the incidence of disability increases with age, as shown here. This includes mobility-related disabilities as well as those related to self-care, like dressing and bathing. And we know that that with age, the need for assistance with housing and housework and shopping and cooking also rises. On the next slide, and talk a little bit about accessibility. Our housing stock in the United States is woefully inadequate in terms of accessibility. Only 3.5% of housing units, that's all units across the board, have single floor living, a no step entry into the home, and wide enough hallways and doorways that could accommodate a wheelchair. And that's that combination column you see on the far right. If you add in a couple of other things that we think are important, like accessible electrical controls and light switches and faucets that you could turn more easily than with the knob, the lever style doorknobs, you get less than 1%. So this is a significant issue. And on the next slide, talk just a moment about the other aspect of support for homes. So not only does the house need to be physically supportive, but help with activities of daily living, with things like shopping, cooking, groceries, shopping, paying bills, that kind of thing. Our analysis shows that 59% of community dwelling older adults report having some unmet need for support with either self-care or with maintaining a home. Now, this care can be purchased, of course, but it's expensive, and the median national cost of homemaker services are $26 an hour. If you had just 8 hours a week, that would be about $11,000 a year, which is roughly about half of the income that a median renter has. And a median older renter makes about $23,000 a year. And it's twice the entire net wealth of the median older renter, which is under $6,000. So clearly needs for support are a big issue. The next slide just talks about one more issue, which is loneliness and social isolation. Before the pandemic, an estimated 43% of older adults were socially isolated, and social isolation has to do with an objective measure of how many connections you have, whereas loneliness is more subjective. It's the feeling of being alone. They are related, and social isolation can lead to loneliness. And all of those, both of those independently and together, can lead to all sorts of repercussions for physical and mental health. So, and that we know that people who live in certain locations and certain households can feel more lonely. And so this is a reason that, that we think about this at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. And lastly, I'm going to wrap up here and turn things over to Donna. Before I do, I just wanted to say that I think the intergenerational housing options can help address these needs for support, these needs for connection with other people, can help paying the bills and the affordability of housing. I think it's more though too. I think it's about interacting with people of different ages is important for all of us. And these are not pictures of housing settings, they're pictures of outdoor settings. I'm an urban planner. It's what motivated me to get into this field to begin with, the idea that we can create places where people of all ages can interact. So I look forward to the conversation, and I'll turn things over to Donna.
Jen, thank you. That was really, really, really helpful. And I do appreciate also talking about the aspects of intergenerational solutions. I just want to remind people who may have joined us a little bit later than at the very beginning that we are taking questions in the Q&A. If you're interested in posing something, whether it's during any of our presentations or towards the end. So please do be sure to ask anything that's on your mind. So now next, Generations United was formed in 1986, and one of our founders said, "We formed Generations United to argue for a caring society." We advocate for programs and policies that connect generations. Over the years, we've seen intergenerational programs evolve from small programs to encompass community-wide efforts, as well as intergenerational living opportunities. Next slide. Our role has evolved. We began in the year 2000 when we worked with policymakers and advocated for legacy, living equitably, grandparents aiding children and youth. That was signed into law as part of a larger federal housing bill. And you can see here we're celebrating and thanking some of the champions who helped us with that. And on the next slide, what that provided was funding for grandparent housing demonstrations, education for the Department of Housing and Urban Development staff, and a national study about grandparent housing and what the needs were. So while legacy was dormant for several years, funding was recently appropriated, actually this year, to help fund additional grandparent housing demonstrations. And that's again through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So next slide. Then in 2012, we went on to develop criteria for best intergenerational communities to enhance age-friendly community development, which we thought was too focused on a single age group. During the next 5 years, we honored more than 25 communities with this designation. And next, in 2010, and then again in 2020, next slide, we released signature reports on the steady and significant increase in multi-generational households. We were the first, and I think still the only, organization that asked families themselves through a national poll what they thought about living in a multi-generational household. We didn't, not what the media thought, not what others thought, what they thought. And what we found was that the families overwhelmingly said that it worked for them. There may be difficulties, but it worked for them. So it's really society that needs to think about changing. Next slide. Then about 5 years ago, the next slide, we really began exploring this concept of what it would take to scale intergenerational home sharing. And we did that work alongside a very dear colleague, Ernest Gonzalez at NYU, who continues to be very active in the area, and our partnership continues to grow. But that was when we first came in contact with Nesterly and met Noelle too. Nesterly was and is the only home sharing service that's focused specifically on intergenerational home sharing and the unique opportunities that there are when we look at, as Jen was saying, the burden of housing for older adults. And then we think about an intergenerational solution when we think about the burden on young people, whether it's acquiring debt, whether it's student loan. But we know that, again, if we're looking at something from an intergenerational solutions lens, we can meet some of the needs and the issues that our country is facing. So as a part of the work on intergenerational home sharing, we began convening a national learning collaborative on intergenerational home sharing to promote the concept, which we know everybody loves, but is not easy to do. And by working with the media to build more understanding and recognition of it, building a national network of people who are interested in their communities in this concept, sharing research and best practices. Now, just like with everyone else, all of a sudden it was 2020 and COVID hit, and most of the intergenerational home sharing efforts shut down. But that's starting to change. But during that time, next slide, we spent some of that time rethinking what Generations United role should be and could be. And we went back to really to our basics, which is that we're here as a national umbrella, a national organization that provides thought leadership. We plant seeds. We try to connect what's going on around the country so that people don't feel like they're doing the only effort in a particular area like home sharing. So we want to really move the national conversation. And what a cool idea it is to think about intergenerational living and intergenerational communities, to understanding that it's very necessary, that it should be viewed as a valuable part of our housing policy, our strategies, our funding streams, and local community-wide planning efforts. So why? There's been a sharp increase in interest from both affordable developers as well as market rate housing developers and housing providers. We know that there's been an increase, that steady increase is going to continue in multi-generational households. But there's also, as we're all aware, a real concern now about the environment, about how we're using our resources. And one or two people rattling around in a huge house by themselves really doesn't make sense when we're thinking about what it takes to maintain that home, to heat and cool that home. But how do we share responsibility for our environment? And the bottom line is it's what people want. Next slide. It's really what people want. 2 in 3 adults say that they'd like to spend more time with another generation. And more people say that if there's the opportunity, they would like to meet and get to know each other. So next slide. And 92% of the people that were polled in this national poll a couple of years ago said that we really were wasting older adult assets and youth assets if we didn't connect them with each other. So next slide. So how does Generations United define intergenerational and multi-generational? Sometimes these terms get really confused, and I think one of the easiest ways to remember is that inter is when you enter, when you connect, and multi is when you might be going side by side down the same road. So for intergenerational households, we think of a skip generation household, oftentimes a grandparent, older relative, a child. In multi-generational households, we define those as 3 or more generations. So it might be a grandparent, a parent, and a child generation. We're seeing more four-generation homes and even 5-generation homes. So the difference between intergenerational and multi-generational, you can put people together in a community center, that's multi-generational. If you actually program, encourage them to interact, that's so intergenerational, multi-generational. But what we've discovered is a continuum of models on the next slide that I'd like to talk about. I want to thank Irv Katz, who's our senior fellow, and a former intern from Cornell, Jai Jin, who spent the summer researching and growing our list of intergenerational housing that we were aware of by 236%, from 42 projects in our database to 141. And that's in the US alone. We know that there are more programs in Canada, in Europe, and around the globe. So the models that we've identified are multi-generational families, which we've talked about, the increase in multi-generational families, grandfamilies housing, intergenerational home sharing, older adults living on campuses, and older adults in households with children. So in the next slide, first with intergenerational home sharing with multi-generational households, we know that there are a large number that are increasing. On the next slide, with campus-based senior housing, we know about Judson Seniors Living, for example, that has set aside several rooms for music students. LaSalle University and Arizona State University have actually built older adult housing on campus. And this is a picture of San Francisco Academy, where older adults live side by side with young people aging out of foster care. So next slide. And then there's grand family apartments and housing complexes. This one's in New York. We do have a state of grand families report on housing, and what we found were 19 existing or in development sites around the country. With intergenerational housing communities on the next slide, a great example is Bridge Meadows and Hope Meadows, and also Genesee House here in Washington, D.C., where they're intentionally built a neighborhood for older and younger people, where families and older adults are intermingled, are living together, and are supporting each other. So next slide. And then when it comes to intergenerational living being integrated into comprehensive community plans and city plans, whether it's new housing or renewed developments, it can be affordable or market rate. I'm really excited that currently our senior fellow Irv Katz and Matt Kaplan from Penn State University are wrapping up a guide they've written, the American Planning Association, and we'll be sharing that as soon as it's published. So next slide. Looking to the future, what we're planning to do is to relaunch our National Learning Collaborative on intergenerational housing with a broader focus on the continuum of models. And the first meeting of that group is going to be on Wednesday, September 21st. Be sure to watch our website for more information or sign up to be notified about it and contact Irv Katz, who's our senior fellow, who's on our website. And that information will be at the end of this presentation as well. So we encourage you to join us, share your ideas and thoughts on models and the future of this work, because we really do think there's a bright future for it. So in closing, I wanted to say that it's not about going back. People always ask me, oh, you want to go back to how things were? And I say, no, we want to go forward to how things can be and should be. And that's recognizing that we're interdependent and we're stronger together. Thank you. So next, it's my pleasure to introduce Noelle Marcus of Nesterly. Noelle is the CEO and founder of Nesterly, an award-winning platform for intergenerational home sharing. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Donna. And I just want to start with to say that I'm so honored to be here next to you and Jennifer, two people I have a lot of respect for and whose work I really admire. And also to thank everyone in the room, just to know that you're here, all of these incredible practitioners, advocates, social scientists, policymakers in the room. It's really, really exciting to be here with all of you. So just to start with, when I was a grad student at MIT, I realized that there were over 54 million spare bedrooms sitting empty every night in the United States. And this really marked a pivotal moment in my life. It led me to Jennifer and really her research at the Joint Center for Housing Studies. And for the first time, I started to understand that there's an important shift occurring in our society, in our built environment, in our communities, and our families. I had worked in public policy for many years before that and worked in the city of New York for the mayor's office and in economic development. And these were conversations that just weren't being had in the circles that I was in, focused on urban environments. So we all know this, we're aging at a rapid pace, and we're completely underprepared, as Jennifer highlighted, for this social transformation. And I've dedicated my life now to this belief that there's a huge need to rethink how we as a society will live well into the future with dignity and choice, especially with some of the complex and contradictory trends that we're seeing. So many of you guys might know this, but a majority of us want to stay in our home and age in place, and yet half of us will be living alone by the time we're 65. So what does that really mean for household sizes and the spaces that we're occupying? And as Donna brought up, the environmental impacts of being in very large spaces and just having single person occupancy in them. And then a couple other examples, we're seeing significant longevity gains, but then coupled with pervasive financial insecurity, where half of seniors have zero savings in their retirement accounts. And we're seeing with COVID that we've seen a huge wave in premature forced early retirement and a decline in the ability to save money in people's retirement savings account. And then finally, this issue that Donna also brought up, which is a rise in social isolation and not unique to older adults, but really spanning generations. And we've seen, as an urban planner as well, we've seen historic levels of age segregation in our communities and our daily lives. So this is really unparalleled. So next slide. In 2017, I started Nesterly, and next slide. Nesterly enables older adults to rent their spare bedrooms to trustworthy tenants for over 30-day stays. So we've taken this age-old idea of intergenerational home sharing and brought it into the digital age by leveraging technology and customer support agents who are with backgrounds in social work to make the service safe, easy to use, and actually scalable. Next slide. We do that just very quickly, take the burden off empty nesters by providing tenant screening, in-compliant leasing documents, reliable and automatic monthly income, and overall support from our social workers throughout the home share. Next slide. And long story short, I just have a few minutes, but it's been working. We've been able to generate life-changing supplemental income for folks on fixed and limited incomes, widows, people forced into premature retirement, and we're seeing on average with just someone's first home share, a take home of $7,200 in just the first 9 months. And at the same time, we're also generating new units of deeply affordable housing that we don't need to spend money on construction costs. We don't need long timelines. We don't have to deal with NIMBYism. They're really there and available that we can get, that we can leverage and open up right away. And as Jennifer's team has noted, the stock of deeply affordable units, we're losing hundreds of thousands of them every year of affordable housing units. And so it's really critical that we have these spaces. So there's hundreds of stories that we can speak to. I'll just share this one. This is a recent picture of Judith. She was on the verge of having to let go of her home. She's She's a single 64-year-old woman and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She met Nadia through Nesterly, who's a recent college grad. She was really frustrated looking in the Boston housing market and finding something that could fit her budget, just as a brand new graduate. And that was 2019, and it's now been 3 years since they moved in together. And to date, Judith has earned over $30,000 in supplemental income. By the end of the home share, they just extended another year. It'll be over $38,000. And this is life-changing. And and as you can see, they also became friends and built this connection. Nadia actually got engaged, and her fiance is moving in for the next year, and they're sharing this home, and really thrilled to do it. So next slide. This is just one of the stories of impact that we're having. So we started in Boston when I graduated, and through incredible partnerships with the city, with Age Friendly Boston, and with others, we've seen just how powerful this model can really be, and we've tried to tell the story. And now we're operating in Columbus and Louisville, but we are just getting started. We've received thousands and thousands of emails, thousands of phone calls from all over the United States and really all over the world. And we're excited to announce today that we're launching a national campaign to empower local communities to build their own intergenerational networks. So we want to take what we've learned, the technology that we've built, and our expertise, and share that through a licensing partnership to all of these different places that have been begging us to expand and come to their communities, because we really know that this solution is not just needed in Boston or Columbus and Louisville or New York City or expensive housing markets, but it's needed all over the United States in all different size communities. And we think it's needed now more than ever. So I just really want to thank you all for this meaningful conversation. I know it's just a taste of what the 3 of us are doing and what this movement is really about. And if you're interested in learning more about our work and how we can partner, please do send me a note. You can go to the next slide. And finally, I just really want to thank Donna, Irv, and the whole team at Generations United for hosting us. And I think really leading the way in this deeply important work around bridging generations that they're doing every day. So thank you.
Thank you, Noelle. So Noelle, if you'll stay on, and Jen, if you'll come back, we're going to have a little bit of time for some Q&A. There were several questions that came in advance that will start us, and I know there's been a few coming in the Q&A online as well. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we were very excited to watch Noelle yesterday on the Today Show. They did a segment on Nesterly, and I think it was a great way of bringing, again, more attention to this opportunity. So thank you. Thank you, Jen and Noelle. So if you want to go off mute, the first question, that we had a number of people who were asking about zoning and funding barriers and opportunities. I wondered if each of you could talk about how you've addressed these, or what you found to be effective when it comes to zoning issues or funding issues for people who want to start programs. And I'll chime in too, but Jen, do you want to start with anything that you've been learning?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think zoning can be an impediment. Zoning certainly restricts housing options and, different types of housing that people might want to share. It can also, in some places, restrict unrelated people from living together. And I think this goes back to the days of boarding houses and zoning that was really trying to address that. So I actually think that there's an awareness issue, that there may be laws on the books that don't need to be there, and that people wouldn't fight too hard to keep there, hopefully. Yeah, and I will say there's a lot of resources around preparing homes for home modification, that kind of thing at the local level, but I can talk about that more. Noelle, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there are some archaic zoning laws that we do come up we do hear about once in a while, and they're rules that really nobody follows anymore. Like if more than 3 unrelated people share a home, it's a prostitution house or something like this. So this just isn't what's happening today. And then in terms of funding, and just another zoning topic is that because all of our home shares are over 30 days, they don't come up against any short-term lodging regulations. So where some companies are encouraging home shares that are 1 or 2 days and really becoming commercial, turning residential property into commercial property, we're actually generating new affordable housing units instead of taking affordable housing off out of the city. So that's not an issue. And then in terms of funding, I think part of it is how we think about funding. So when I was working at the city of New York, I worked on an $8.2 billion affordable housing plan. And cities are spending anywhere up to $800,000 per unit of affordable housing that they're subsidizing. So how do we think about, this is a very, very cost-effective program. How do we tap into different types of funding from cities, from area agencies on aging, from dollars that would, taking a very small fraction of dollars that would go to building new housing to unlocking underutilized housing stock.
When I think about funding too, I mentioned earlier that there is legacy intergenerational housing that occasionally has appropriations, which is part of the puzzle if people are thinking about grandparents housing. There's also a publication that we did that featured Bridge Meadows, for example. I think folks there are just pros at how to put together this complex puzzle of funding. So on our website, there's a publication about how you fund what I think in that particular publication, we're talking about intergenerational shared sites, but many of the funding sources are similar. And then I think it also takes that advocacy role before city councils, before county commissions, to talk about how this is an asset and an economic driver in your community and worthy of an investment. What I've seen in the programs that we've had the opportunity to work with is it takes that drive, tenacity, and that vision to stay with it to get it done. But it is being done, and Jen and Noelle are great champions and examples of how that's being done. So somebody asked a question about the psychological benefits, and I know Jen, you talked a little bit about social isolation and loneliness, but when you think about it, are there psychological benefits or potential drawbacks to intergenerational living? Is intergenerational living for everyone? Jen, you want to start us?
Sure. I always say that we need lots of options, that the population 65 and over is very large and growing very quickly, and will soon be a third of all households in the United States. This is one of them. And I think it's an important one that can really move us forward on so many of these challenges. I am, as I hinted at the end of my presentation, a firm believer in intergenerational neighborhoods, no matter what house you live in. And I think that, they're not interchangeable, but that fostering physical environments and social programming that helps create those intergenerational interactions is really important. Noelle, maybe you have some thoughts on the psychological benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I would just tell one very quick short story, but one of our hosts was interviewed by a journalist and their guest as well. And the host actually had been in their neighborhood for many decades and had friends in their neighborhood and, was really connected to the community. And it was actually the young person, the young grad student who was new to the city, who brought up social isolation and said, before I went to grad school, I had never eaten alone before. And it was really hard. And so when I get lonely, I just, go down to my host and see if my neighbor, go down to the kitchen and see if they want to share a meal. And so I think this idea of social isolation being something just that older adults are facing really turned it on its head. That we're seeing the negative impacts of, as you mentioned, Jennifer, of age segregated neighborhoods impacting all generations. And so I think that's an obvious one when you think about social determinants of health. isolation is a major factor. But then also housing security, and what are the social implications and emotional and mental and health implications of having insecurity in your housing. And it's not just young people that are housing insecure. A lot of older adults are actually housing insecure, thanks to your data, Jennifer. But it's not just older renters, it's older homeowners who, the number of older households who have mortgages has, I think, doubled or tripled. I mean, the numbers are getting bigger and bigger, and rising property taxes, rising maintenance costs, delayed maintenance, inflation, rising costs of living on fixed incomes. This is all putting a lot of financial pressure on our older adults. So housing security is also an issue that touches every generation, and does have an impact on our mental and physical health.
We're getting a number of questions about how Nesterly operates, and I'm wondering, Noelle, if it makes sense to suggest that people go to your website directly or contact you, or if you just briefly want to give a little bit of an overview of that, and then we'll tackle some other questions.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. That I won't go into all of them, but and I couldn't keep up with the chat fully. But yes, please go to our website. I'll type in, or if our Generations United team can type in my email address, that would be great. And you can get a lot more detail on how we operate. I think the biggest question that we see, and what we've taken really seriously, is safety and security. So we put in a lot of upfront investment to have a multi-tiered screening process that's kind of unparalleled in background checks. We check references, we require a complete application, and we designed the platform flexible. So they define who they're looking for, they decide who they want to live with, and then we've really invested in a team of social workers as our frontline and customer support agents. So there's really, really strong human support at every step of the way, wherever it's needed, and then using technology to make it accessible and affordable to scale a program like this across the country. So that's sort of our balance, but I'm happy to have you reach out to me and look at our website. It's my email was just shared, and yeah, would love to engage further.
I think what you said is really important, Noelle, in that when we were first looking into this area, people thought it should be really easy. It's just like an app, like you just hit, it's like, a dating app or whatever, and you're just going to connect with somebody, and you'll either leave after coffee or you'll decide that it's going to continue. But in fact, it's people, and it's very human. One of the things that we always say with multi-generational families, for example, is when they're thinking about coming together, is the most important thing is communication. And it's the ground rules, it's to understand the responsibilities, and it's to understand that nobody is going to change just because they met you. And if they're a slob, or if they're a night owl, if they like to eat junk food instead of broccoli, they're not going to change. So there are certain things that people have to realize, that that's a human factor, it's a communications factor. So
Absolutely.
There've been a couple questions, including in today's Q&A, about tools. Like, is there a tool on how do you do this intergenerational home sharing, or how do you build an intergenerational community? How do you build a community? Are there any tools that you would recommend, or what would you recommend be developed? Because I think that's a challenge for all of us in particular, is how do we develop tools to enable and make it easier for people to pursue this kind of living arrangement and this kind of community. So Jen, do you want to?
Yeah, I think there are pockets of tools out there, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you are trying to create an intentional community, sort of a co-living situation, there are workbooks and models on governance and funding and all of that design. I don't know of any specific to the intergenerational realm, although Noelle and Donna may correct me. I do think such a tool would be great. What I have in mind actually is some kind of interface where you can go and sort of find your own adventure. What do you want to do? What do you want to create? And one of the things that we know One of the questions that came in before the webinar was about how do people find resources to make their homes ready to have a home sharer in it, whether that's repairs or whatnot. And there are databases of those too. If you look at homemods.org out of UC Davis, there's a whole extensive list of home modification programs. There are city programs, state programs. So they're out there. I think what we need to do is centralize information and make it easier for people to find. And on the intergenerational aspect, certainly we're doing some research on that right now. What makes intentional communities click? What makes them have staying power? That will be out in December. It's not a guide, but it's a little bit of an insight. And I'll turn off my, as the dogs start barking, and turn to Noelle and Donna.
Noelle?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't planning to present this or bring this up, but I think this is a good moment. In my dream world, just like Jennifer's dream solution tool that we need, I would pay Generations United a lot of money to create. I would get someone, I think we need an organizing body just in the space that we're working on, intergenerational home sharing, to focus and hire Jennifer Malinsky as a consultant on the project, but to focus on public policy solutions and advocacy to make it really easy for people to do this. So right now there aren't a lot of barriers. There's a couple archaic laws with 3 or more, unrelated people, but actually a lot of our programs, it's one family with one guest. So we don't even come across those rules. But other countries and other places actually, I saw a question about income, and does that income need to be taxed? And so they're in the UK, they actually, if you're doing home sharing, if this intergenerational home sharing model, that income is not taxable income. So what sort of incentives can we design to actually encourage people to do this? Because it's not just benefiting them, it's benefiting our society. It's generating new affordable housing, it's increasing social connectedness, it's reducing healthcare costs. So how do we design public policy? And then in Massachusetts, we have, if you have another member of your household join, then when you calculate benefits, you calculate your joint household income. But really, if you're taking in a grad student or a recent college graduate, their income shouldn't impact your public benefits if you're a senior who's on many public benefits. So there's some states that have developed laws that have this workaround if it's a housemaid and you're renting a room, but not every state does. So I think we actually do need national level kind of policy think tank to think, what can we do to incentivize, and what are the little pieces that are important that we take down, the little barriers that exist that really this is something we want to encourage, and there are policy changes that can be made to do that.
I appreciate that, Noelle. I appreciate the idea that perhaps the 3 of us could work together on an upcoming project to keep this moving forward. Because it really is true. I think when we first started thinking about this, a part of it was that connection between enabling older adults to age in place, as well as reduce student loan debt, with the idea that if we could show that it worked, that perhaps we can incentivize so that young people would have at least part of their student loan debt forgiven, because they're enabling an older adult to age in place. So I think we need to think more creatively about some of our policies, as well as look at how we have really artificially segregated ages, and we've built these barriers to making it easier to connect people. I wanted to address one question that has come up, and before we go to another, and that is there's some question about grandparent or grandfamily apartments and housing. And one of the recommendations that we have made is to create a toolkit on how to develop that kind of housing. But I have to admit, having worked in this space, I have been so impressed with the way that the current providers are holding a handout to people who are getting into the area, how they've passed on learning to each other, how they've developed their own sort of informal learning community. Because I go all the way back to when the first housing was developed in Boston, and New York went on to learn from them, Washington went on to learn from them. So the designs and how these housing developments are created and staffed and how they're lived in has evolved. But someone was asking about what happens when the family configuration changes. And that's one of the really essential things about grandparent apartments in particular. The ones that we've seen that have really excelled have either built as a part of or attached to a senior living community, or they have built so that they're adjacent or so that they're close, because as the children age out and leave, and the older adult no longer qualifies for the housing, you don't want to displace them to a new neighborhood, to a new area. You want them to stay connected to a community if it's at all possible. So there are ways that people are trying to find to work around that. So one of the areas that has been talked about too is how do current efforts like age-friendly communities and age-friendly universities intersect with intergenerational home sharing and community building? Are there ways that those efforts can intersect to support intergenerational home sharing and community building? So Noelle, do you want to start?
Wait, I think maybe Jennifer, if you don't mind starting, I think you might have a better answer than me.
Oh, sure. I don't. I mean, I think that the focus of age-friendly universities, age-friendly communities is, it should be, if it isn't, creating welcoming communities for people of all ages. And so the goal, I think, is a shared goal. Age-friendly communities, I think, often focus on welcoming people into public spaces. And, do we have safe streets? Do we have benches? Do we have, not just facilities for kids, but facilities for people of all ages where interactions can happen? And I think there's also a programming element. And I think, just as an aside to Donna's point about grandparent housing, one thing that we have learned in our research so far, which is in progress, is the importance of the programming and the importance of the physical design. Having those community spaces is really important. So I do think that there's intersection, and it would be lovely if more of the age-friendly communities and age-friendly universities took on, worked with Nesterly to facilitate actual home sharing within those places. It's all in the same spirit.
That's great. And I really do think that one of the things that we continue to advocate for is to make sure that when we're talking about age friendly, we're talking about all age friendly. And I think that's one of the roles that we have is that intergenerational aspect, and to look at generations as being an asset to each other. So I'm very excited about what we're starting to see with some of the universities and the campus. We've also heard about in the past, there actually were dorms for older adults invited to live in a dorm with students. So there are other ways that we can promote these models. But we did have a question. I thought this was interesting about whether or not Nesterly, in particular, but Jen, maybe you've heard of this also, has run into any cultural or racial issues.
Yeah, I mean, kind of playing off some of Jennifer's data that she shared today, it's really interesting that actually communities of color tend to have higher rates of multi-generational housing, and that, am I getting this correct, Jennifer? Correct me if I'm wrong, but that we actually see a higher adoption rate from communities of color and diverse communities. So it's actually just closer to it just tends to be something that's maybe closer to what had been done historically, and maybe less stigmatized. And so on our platform, we're not controlling who lives with who. It's actually, we're empowering the people on the platform to make their own decisions. And we have an incredible, when you look at our home shares, it's not just across age, it's not just across class or socioeconomics. It can be across race and gender and country and religion. And we actually see people really bridging and building these friendships and living together with so many differences, and finding similarities and finding different ways of connecting. And just as Donna so eloquently said, that each person brings an asset, and finding that. So we're really seeing amazing opportunity to get to know different people through this experience. So yeah, that's what I would add.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that was a great response.
I did want to repeat that on September 21st,
Hmm.
we are going to be reconvening and reimagining our national collaboration on intergenerational community building. And there'll be more information that will come out about that, but it's on September 21st at 3 o'clock Eastern time. And that collaboration in the past has met quarterly. And we just encourage people who are interested in this. The whole idea is to learn from each other, to share information, to share resources, and to share struggles. Because I know there's been a whole lot in the chat about tax implications, about whether it will impede the supports that an older adult may receive if they have income coming in. How do we make sure that we're dealing with that? How do we make sure that we're convincing elected officials that this is in their community's best interest, and that it's a wave of the future for people to be together and not segregated separately out. So as we're getting close to wrapping up and winding down, it's a conversation that we could probably have forever. And I know there's a lot of questions we haven't gotten to that we'll be trying to respond offline or share with people. But I wanted to ask both Noelle and Jennifer if they have closing comments or words of wisdom that they want to share with our participants today. So Jennifer, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Donna. Thank you, Noelle, for the work you both do, and to Generations United for hosting today. I will just say there was a comment in the chat about this being a relatively small share of people who are engaged in this, and how to make the case. And I would just say, I think we do need multiple options, and this is a really important one that speaks to hits on so many of the challenges that people face, that young people and older people face in terms of finding suitable housing. I am reminded of accessory dwelling units, or in-law flats, or whatever you want to call them in your part of the country. They're not, in my mind, going to solve the housing crisis, but they are chipping away at it. And I think all of these things can do that. And in this case, you have this added benefit of all the social good and the real, I'm sure, lifelong relationships that people are building through programs like Nesterly. So.
Thank you. Noelle?
Yeah, I think I would just piggyback off Jennifer. I'm so inspired by the work that you two are doing. So delighted to be here and to see so many people engaged in this conversation. And I think we'll try to answer the Q&A. Maybe we can even email it out after. We can write answers and share it with everyone, because it was too many questions in a short period. But I would just say that according to AARP's National Community Survey, 40% of older adults say they're interested in renting a room out in their home, and only 2% are doing it. So it means that this is an idea that a lot of people are open to, a lot of people are considering, but how do we provide, as we've been talking about, the right tools, and how do we make it easy? A lot of people aren't going to go to Craigslist and try, find someone on Craigslist who's in their 70s or an older adult. So how do we create a safe, accessible, affordable way to provide the support that they need to take this step? And I also believe, my internet might be a little unstable, I also believe it's not for everyone, but we need more innovation in this space, and we need more people caring about this and pushing new ideas forward. And that's the biggest issue that I think my generation is going to face. How do we take care of our parents? How do we take care of our grandparents and give them options?
That's great. Thank you. I mean, what you both have reminded me of is one of my favorite songs about if 1 and 2 and 50 make a million, we'll see that day come around. And I'm very glad that we're in this work together. It's been an honor to be here with you today. Thank you. I want to thank again Jennifer Malinsky and Noelle Marcus for co-sponsoring today's webinar and for their really inspiring presentations and information. I want to thank our GU Senior Fellow, Irv Katz, for keeping our intergenerational and community building work moving forward. I also want to thank the terrific Generations United staff, the wizards behind the curtain that have kept this thing going today, and those that are cheering us on in the audience. The video recording will be available shortly, and we encourage you to share it with others who may be interested. That includes someone who asked a question about whether they'd be able to show it in their class. And please, you're very welcome to show it in your class and share it with those that are interested. We want to encourage you to stay in touch. Be sure to sign up for Generations This Week, which is our weekly newsletter that alerts you to all things intergenerational, including future webinars, our 2023 in-person global conference that will be held here in Washington, D.C. We hope to see many of you. And if you can remember one thing from today, I hope you'll remember the most powerful solutions to the complex issues we face today will involve and value intergenerational teams. We are stronger together. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.